The moment Edgar Kendrick accepted the job, he told himself it was just another escort, just another trail, just another $50 riding in his coat pocket. He told himself that lie for exactly 3 miles before Alberta Lockhart laughed at something a meadowlark did in the tall grass, and he understood with perfect, terrible clarity that he was already in serious trouble. It was the spring of 1878, and the New Mexico territory was the kind of beautiful that could break a man if he stared too long at it. The high desert bloomed reluctant and stubborn after the winter rains, with Indian paintbrush burning orange and red along the creek banks, and the cottonwoods throwing their white fluff into the dry wind like they were trying to fill the sky with snow. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains held their snowcaps still, white against a blue so clean and deep it made the eyes ache, and the land between Santa Fe and the upper territories was long and wild, and full of silence that spoke if you listened to it hard enough. Edgar had been listening to that silence for 12 years. He had come west at 17, raw and lean and hungry, off a failing farm in eastern Tennessee where the soil had gone thin and his father's ambitions had gone thinner. He had punched cattle, scouted for the cavalry, run dispatch in weather that would stop a reasonable man dead, and eventually settled into the work of a hired rider, the kind of man who knew the trails and the people on them, who could navigate a dispute or a difficult crossing, who could be trusted to get a person or a package from one end of dangerous country to the other in reasonable condition. He was 29 years old now, brown from the sun, quiet by habit, and not given to the kind of foolishness that arrived on horseback with a woman's laughter. He had been sitting in the office of Harlan Morse, a freight agent and general arranger of things in Santa Fe, when the arrangement had been explained to him. Morse was a round man with a waxed mustache and the nervous hands of someone who handled other people's problems for a living. He had laid the situation out plainly, the way plainness sometimes is used to obscure the complicated truth underneath. "Her name is Alberta Lockhart," Morse had said, tapping a folded letter on the desk in front of him. "Is traveling north to the Colorado Territory to the town of Coldwell Creek. She has a fiance there, a man named Dalton Pierce, who is a mine owner and a man of some means. He sent the money south to arrange her travel. She has been in Santa Fe for 3 weeks waiting on a proper escort now that the last guide took sick. You know the trail. I know you know it. The pay is $50 for getting her there safely, with a further 10 on delivery." Edgar had asked the questions a sensible man asked. How old was she? What was her background? Did she ride? Did she shoot? What kind of woman was traveling alone to an engagement in the Colorado Territory without family accompanying her? Morse had answered carefully. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher from the town of Las Cruces, both of her parents now deceased. She had accepted the proposal of Dalton Pierce by correspondence, the kind of arrangement that was not uncommon in those years, when the territories were full of men who had built something and needed someone to build a life alongside. She rode adequately and had never fired a weapon, but was described by the woman at the boarding house where she had been staying as sensible and not prone to complaint. Edgar had pocketed the advance and told himself again that it was just another trail. He had collected her the following morning at the boarding house on Palace Avenue, a modest adobe building with a blue door and a climbing rose along the front wall that had not yet come into flower. He had expected someone timid. The women who arrived in the territories by correspondence arrangement were not always timid, but they often had a pressed, careful quality about them, as though they were trying very hard to be the version of themselves that had been described in letters. Alberta Lockhart was not timid, and she was not pressed and careful. She came through the blue door with a traveling bag in each hand and a wide-brimmed hat already on her head, and she looked at him the way a person looks at something they are assessing rather than something they are afraid of. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way that got described in the dime novels that were beginning to circulate through the territory saloons. She was of medium height with dark hair pulled back practically under the hat, and she had brown eyes that were too direct and a mouth that sat in a slight natural curve that made it seem like she was on the verge of saying something. She was dressed in a sensible dark blue riding skirt and a white shirtwaist, and she wore leather gloves and boots that had seen real use. "You are Mr. Kendrick," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he said. "Are you good at this?" she asked. He had been asked a great many questions in his years of escort work. That particular one was new. "Yes," he said. She studied him for a moment longer, the way a person studies a contract before signing it. Then she nodded once, as though she had reached a satisfactory conclusion, and handed him the heavier of the two bags. "My horse is stabled at the end of the street," she said. "She is a bay mare named Clover, and she is perfectly behaved so long as you do not make sudden loud noises around her left side. She lost hearing in that ear from a rattlesnake bite 2 years ago, and she startles." He had not expected her to have her own horse. He had expected to rent her one. The fact that she had brought a horse from Las Cruces spoke of someone who had planned and prepared, someone who took the physical reality of the journey seriously. He had loaded her bags, and they had ridden out of Santa Fe in the early morning light with the mountains ahead of them and the smell of piñon smoke from the waking town at their backs. And for the first few miles, he had told himself everything he needed to tell himself about the nature of this job and the importance of its simple completion. And then the meadowlark had done its ridiculous hop-and spin in the grass at the trail's edge, the kind of small, absurd thing that birds do when they are entirely indifferent to human observation, and Alberta Lockhart had laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one, brief and bright, the kind that escapes before a person can decide whether to let it out or not, and she had glanced at him sideways as though checking whether he had seen it too. He had seen it. And the laugh had hit him somewhere behind the sternum like a well-placed elbow, and he had looked at the trail ahead and understood, with the clarity of a man who has just stepped off a ledge he thought was solid ground, that the next 2 weeks were going to require more careful management than any trail he had ever ridden. The first day was long and warm, with the wind from the southwest carrying the smell of coming rain that never arrived. They followed the old Camino Real North, the ancient road that had been carrying people up and down the spine of the territory since before anyone Edgar knew had been born. The land here was wide and open, with the mountains to the east and the long rolling mesa country to the west, and the trail itself was good, clear and well used and unmarked by any recent trouble. He rode with the professional half-attention of long experience, watching the ridges and the arroyos the way a man watches for weather, and he learned in those first hours that Alberta Lockhart was not a woman given to idle conversation, but was also not a woman who sat silent out of shyness. She asked questions when she had them. She observed things aloud when something struck her as worth noting. She rode well, with the easy balanced seat of someone who had spent real time in the saddle, and she did not ask him to slow down or complain about the sun or the dust or the long stretches without shade. Around midday they stopped at a spring near a stand of cottonwoods to water the horses and eat the food the boarding house had packed, biscuits and salt pork and dried apricots, and she sat on a flat rock near the water with her hat off and her dark hair coming loose from its pins in the breeze, and she said to him, "Tell me honestly what the trail is like north of here." He told her. He was honest because he saw the point of honesty with someone who would be riding the trail regardless of what he said. There were good stretches and there were harder ones. The crossing at the Rio Chama could be running high this time of year. There was a section north of Taos that had seen some trouble with horse thieves the previous autumn but had been quiet since winter. The weather could change fast in the higher elevations. She listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, and when he finished she said, "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" 8 years of riding Escort, 12 years out here altogether, he said. She looked at him steadily. "Do you like it?" The question surprised him because no one asked that. People asked if he was reliable. They asked if he knew the route. They did not ask if he liked it. Most of the time, he said, it suits me. What suits you about it? He thought about it genuinely because she seemed to be asking genuinely. The land, he said finally. And the fact that it's simple, you get someone somewhere safe. Either you manage it or you don't. There is not a lot of room for the in-between. She looked at the water of the spring moving slow and clear over the pebbles. I have been told that simplicity is a virtue, she said, and something in her voice had a quality he could not quite identify, something that lived in the space between what she said and what she meant. You don't think so? He asked, and he was not sure why he asked because it was not the kind of question that was his business. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think simplicity is restful. I am not sure it is the same thing as a life. He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and they rode on. They made camp that first night in a hollow below a red sandstone ridge, where the wind broke and the fire burned steady, and he set up the bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire the way propriety required, and she made no comment about the arrangement, and neither did he. He boiled coffee, and she produced a small tin of sugar from her bag that she offered to him without asking if he wanted it. Just set it near his cup, and that small, unself-conscious gesture lodged itself somewhere in him where he did not want it to lodge. She wrote in a small leather journal by the firelight after supper, and he sat with his coffee and watched the ridge line and the stars coming out above it, thick and brilliant as they only got away from towns, and he thought about Dalton Pierce up in Coldwell Creek and what kind of man he was, and why a woman like Alberta Lockhart had agreed to marry a man she had never met. He knew why women made those agreements. The territories were not kind to unmarried women of modest means. The safety and security of a household and a husband who could provide was not a small thing when you had buried your parents and had no family to return to. He understood the mathematics of it. He just found himself, sitting there in the firelight with the smell of pinon smoke and coffee and the high, clean air of the desert night, resenting the mathematics in a way that was not reasonable and was not his place. You should sleep, he said, because he needed to say something that was practical and had nothing to do with what he was thinking. We want to be moving before full light tomorrow. I know, she said, but she wrote in the journal for another 10 minutes before she closed it and settled into her bedroll, and he sat watch until the small hours and told himself very firmly that his feelings were not relevant to the job, and his feelings listened to him about as well as the desert wind did. The second day was harder and more interesting. They pushed north through broken country where the trail climbed and dropped, crossing 2 dry arroyos and skirting the edge of a mesa where the view west went on for 100 miles, and Alberta pulled Clover up and simply sat for a long moment looking at it. Not saying anything, just looking, and Edgar sat beside her and looked too, and he was aware in the most acute way of her nearness, the few feet between their horses, the way the wind moved the loose hair at her temple. They forded a creek in the early afternoon that was running clear and cold from the snowmelt, and Clover picked her way across without fuss, and on the far bank, Alberta turned to look back at the crossing with an expression that was private but that he caught at its edge, something that looked like satisfaction, like a woman noting something accomplished. In the late afternoon, they encountered the first other human beings since leaving Santa Fe, a small train of freight wagons heading south, 4 wagons driven by 2 Mexican freighters, and an Anglo teamster who nodded at Edgar with the brief recognition of men who share a trade. The freighter in the lead called out a warning about a washed-out section of trail 10 miles north, the spring flooding from the Chama having cut across the usual route, and gave directions for the detour. Edgar thanked him and passed the information to Alberta, and she said, "How much does that add to the journey?" "Half a day, maybe," he said. "Could be less." She thought about it for a moment. "All right," she said, simple as that. He found, over those first 2 days, that she had a quality of acceptance toward the unavoidable that he respected deeply, because it was not passivity. She did not accept things because she felt she had no choice. She accepted them because she evaluated them and found them to be genuinely what they were, facts of the landscape rather than impositions to resent. There was a clear-eyed quality to her thinking that he had rarely encountered in anyone, man or woman, and it made conversation with her feel like standing on solid ground. It also made him like her in ways that were not professional and not appropriate to the task at hand, and he managed this by being careful with himself, by maintaining his distance and his brevity, by doing his job competently and efficiently, which is what he had been paid to do. On the morning of the third day, 3 miles north of their second camp, riding through a long, shallow valley where the blue grama grass was coming up new and green between the dry remnants of last year's growth, a young red-tailed hawk went after a prairie dog in the grass 20 feet from the trail. A spectacular loud crashing dive that ended in a brief violent scramble, and then the hawk rising again with its prize, laboring upward into the morning sky. Alberta made a sound that was not quite a word, a breath-caught, astonished, delighted sound, and she pulled Clover up and watched the hawk until it was a small dark shape against the blue and then smaller and then gone. And then she turned to Edgar with her eyes bright and alive and laughing, and she said, "Did you see that? Have you ever seen anything so extraordinary in your life?" And Edgar Kendrick, who had been managing himself with great discipline and considerable success for 2.5 days, looked at her face, open and shining with pure delight at the hawk and the morning and the sky, and felt the last of his carefully maintained professional distance quietly collapse. He was in love with her, not in the way of infatuation, the quick hot thing that blew through and burned itself out, in the deep, certain, quiet way that a man recognizes when he has found the person whose presence makes the world make more sense. He knew it with the same clarity with which he knew the land, the kind of knowing that lives in the body before the mind catches up. And he also knew with equal clarity that he had been hired to deliver her to another man. He said, "Yes, I saw it," and he looked back at the trail ahead and he kept riding. The trouble, of course, was that knowledge does not undo feeling. It only makes you more aware of it. For the remainder of that morning, he rode beside her and talked with her about the valley they were crossing and the plants along the creek and the history of the territory, because she asked about these things and he knew about them. And every exchange was a small, precise aggravation of the thing he had told himself he could not allow. She had a way of asking questions that was not interrogation but genuine interest, the habit of a schoolteacher's daughter who had grown up at the table where ideas were taken seriously. She asked about the Pueblo people whose abandoned settlements they passed, old stone structures on the canyon walls that spoke of a civilization of considerable complexity. He told her what he knew, which was not as much as he wished, and she was not satisfied with easy answers which he found he did not mind in the slightest. "Did you go to school?" she asked him at one point. "Through the age of 14, he said. "Then the farm took all of it." "What did you read before the farm took all of it?" "Whatever my mother had," he said. "She had a Bible and a copy of Robinson Crusoe and 3 volumes of history about the ancient world that she had from her own father. I read all of them a number of times." She was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "A man who read the ancient world 3 times before he was 14 is not a man who just happened to end up out here. He did not know what to do with that." "No," he said finally, "I don't suppose he is." They camped that third night near the Chama River, upstream from the flooded section the freighter had warned them about, and the sound of the high water was loud in the darkness, the river running fast and yellow-brown with snowmelt, and Edgar built the fire on the highest ground he could find and kept his boots on in case the water rose in the night. It did not rise, but he lay awake a long while listening to the river and the fire and the occasional sound of the horses shifting on their pickets, and he thought with great thoroughness about what he was doing. He had been hired to bring her to Coldwell Creek. He had been paid. He had taken the money and made the agreement, and his word was the only currency that actually mattered in the work he did, because without it he was nothing out here, just another man on horseback. He could not let his feelings alter the nature of the job. That was clear. But clarity did not help him understand how he was going to spend another 10 or 11 days riding beside her, learning her, coming to know the particular way her mind worked, and the particular quality of her laughter, and the particular straightness of the way she looked at things, and then hand her off to a man she had never met who had purchased her passage north, and ride away and go back to his simple life on the trail. He got up before dawn and put more wood on the fire and made coffee and stood watching the river in the gray light and tried to think about the man Dalton Pierce and whether he was a good man and whether Alberta would be content there in Coldwell Creek with the mine and the mountains and the life that correspondence had arranged. He did not know. He had never heard of Dalton Pierce except through the mouth of Harlan Morse, which was not the most reliable conduit for truth in the territory. She came out of her bedroll in the early light, wrapped in her coat, and came to stand beside him at the fire and pour herself coffee, and they stood for a while in silence watching the river, and it was the first silence they had shared that felt different from all the other silences, weighted with something that was not just the comfortable quiet of two people who had gotten used to each other's company. "You are worrying about something," she said, not a question. "The crossing," he said, because it was true and because it served as a shield for the other truth. She nodded and looked at the river. "It is very high. We will go upstream another 2 miles to where there is a natural ford. It will be better there." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the water and said, very quietly, "Mr. Kendrick." "Edgar," he said, because they had been 2 days on the trail and she had been calling him Mr. Kendrick with a faint formality that felt increasingly like a wall between them, and he was tired of the wall even though the wall was sensible and he had built half of it himself. She glanced at him sideways and the corner of her mouth moved. "Edgar," she said, "have you done this kind of escort work for a long time?" "Enough years," he said. "Have you ever lost anyone?" "No," he said, and that was true, and he was glad to be able to say it truthfully. "Good," she said, and drank her coffee, and that was all, and he understood that the question had been about something more than the safety record, that she had been checking something else, taking a kind of measure that he could not entirely see. The ford 2 miles upstream was still running high but manageable, the water clear here and broken into riffles over a wide gravel bar that kept it from exceeding 4 feet in the deepest channel. He went first on his gray gelding pitch, reading the bottom, and then came back and they crossed together, the water cold and loud around the horse's legs, and she rode Clover without hesitation through the current with a concentration and steadiness that he noted and added to the growing account of her that he was keeping without meaning to. On the far bank, he caught himself watching her wring the water from the hem of her riding skirt with the practical efficiency of someone who had done difficult things before and expected to do more of them, and he turned away and checked his saddle cinch with more attention than it needed. They made good time through the 4th day, pushing into higher country where the piñon gave way to ponderosa pine, and the air smelled cold and sharp and alive. And they had their best conversation yet, ranging from the nature of the mining industry in the territories, which she knew more about than he expected because of the letters she had exchanged with Pierce, to the question of whether the territory would ever achieve statehood, to the habits of the ravens that followed them for a while through the pines. Glossy and intelligent, and entirely unbothered by human presence. He told her a story from his scouting days about a raven that had led him to a water source in the Jornada del Muerto when his canteen had been dry for 18 hours, and she listened with the full quality of attention that she gave to everything. And when he finished, she said, "Did you name it?" "I did not name the raven," he said. "I would have named it," she said. "What would you have called it?" She thought about it. "Providence," she said. He laughed. It came out before he could check it, and it felt like releasing something that had been held a long time. She looked at him with an expression he had not seen before, something surprised and pleased, and she said, "You have a very good laugh for someone who appears to be rationing it carefully." "I am out here," he said, "rationing it." The look on her face changed into something warmer, and he made himself look at the pine-covered slope ahead and nod at her, and they rode on. The 5th day brought the first real trouble. They were 2 days north of Taos, in a stretch of country that was beautiful and remote, when they came across a man sitting beside a dead horse in the middle of the trail. He was a young man, perhaps 20, Anglo, with a broken leg that he had splinted himself with a stick and a strip torn from his shirt, and he had been there since the previous evening when the horse had stepped in a prairie dog hole and gone down and snapped its leg, and he had been forced to shoot it. He was dehydrated and in considerable pain, and very relieved to see other human beings. His name was Caleb Foster, and he was traveling south to Santa Fe from a ranch north of Taos where he had worked until the previous week when the ranch had folded, and he had been paid off and let go. He had family in Santa Fe, a sister and her husband. Alberta was off her horse and kneeling beside him before Edgar had fully assessed the situation, and she had his water canteen, and she was checking the splint with quiet efficiency, asking him questions about his pain and the location of the break, and Edgar watched her do this with a feeling in his chest that he had given up trying to argue with. "The splint is good," she told Caleb, "but it needs to be padded here at the top where the stick is cutting into your shin." She used a cloth from her traveling bag, and Edgar supplemented it with a piece of leather from his kit, and together they improved the splint and got more water into him and discussed what to do. The ranch north of Taos was 2 hours back. Santa Fe was more than a full day south. Taos itself was the closest settlement, about 4 hours north on the trail. "We can take him into Taos," Alberta said to Edgar, as though this were simply the obvious course of action and required only his confirmation. "It means a stop," Edgar said. "Yes," she said. She looked at him directly. "It means a stop." He said, "All right," because there was no other answer that he could have lived with, and Alberta gave Caleb a look of calm reassurance that was not false and not condescending but simply human, and said, "Can you ride behind me? I think Clover can carry us both for 4 hours." They got Caleb onto Clover behind Alberta, his broken leg held carefully out to the side, and they rode slowly north to Taos, and Edgar rode beside them and listened to Alberta keep Caleb talking to manage his pain and his fear, asking him about his family and his work and his plans, the same quality of genuine interest she brought to everything. And Caleb, who had been frightened and alone and hurting, gradually calmed under the influence of being listened to with real attention. They reached Taos in the late afternoon, and Edgar got Caleb to the doctor and paid the first $1 of the visit before the young man could protest. And Caleb gripped his hand and thanked him, and then turned to Alberta and thanked her with a brightness in his eyes that had nothing to do with the broken leg. The brightness of someone who has been reminded by a stranger's kindness that the world is not as indifferent as it sometimes appears. They stayed in Taos that night, at separate rooms in the town's small hotel, because the delay with Caleb had made riding further impractical, and Edgar ate supper alone in the hotel's small dining room and thought about the day and the straightforward way she had gotten off her horse and made herself useful, and the fact that when she'd said it means a stop, she had said it as though she expected him to see immediately that there was only one right answer, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She came down to supper later and sat across the table from him and said, "He will be all right. The doctor says the break was clean." "Good," Edgar said. She ordered the bean soup and ate it with the quiet appetite of someone who had worked a physical day, and then she said, without looking up from the soup, "You paid the doctor's first $1. "It seemed the thing to do," he said. She looked up at him then. In the lamplight of the small dining room her brown eyes were dark and direct, and he held her gaze and felt it in his blood. "It was the thing to do," she said. "I wanted you to know that I noticed." He did not know what to say to that either, so he said, "How is the soup?" She made a face that was mock-critical and said, "Adequate," and he laughed again, and the wall between them went down another several feet. The 6th day was one of the better days of Edgar Kendrick's life, and he was aware of this even as it was happening, with the particular alertness of someone who has begun to understand that they are running out of time. They rode through country of increasing altitude and drama, through aspen groves where the new leaves were an almost painful green, and along ridge lines where the views opened to the east and the west simultaneously, the whole vast territory lying out below them like something too large for the mind to fully contain, and he talked to her more freely than he had talked to anyone in years. He told her about Tennessee and his father and the farm and the years of it, the work that had been relentless and the land that had given less and less no matter how much was asked of it. He told her about coming west at 17 and the first months of it, the enormity of the space and the sky, and the particular freedom and terror of a country that had no memory of you and would not mourn you if you failed. He did not usually tell people these things. He was not a man who told people things. But she listened in the way that made telling feel natural, not like self-exposure but like conversation, and she told him things in return. She told him about her parents, the schoolteacher father who had filled their house in Las Cruces with books and argument, and a fierce conviction that the mind was the only thing that could not be taken from you, and the mother who had been equally fierce in the practical domain, who could manage a household on very little and do it with grace. She had been 17 when her mother died of typhoid, and 21 when her father followed her, his heart having given out the way hearts do when the person they have been keeping company with is gone. He loved her completely, Alberta said, looking at the aspen-covered slope to her left as they rode. From the first day. He told me once that he knew within the first hour of meeting her that he could not imagine a future that did not include her, and that this knowledge frightened him considerably at the time. Edgar said nothing, but something inside him recognized the description with a painful precision. Did it frighten her? He asked. She said she knew it too, Alberta said. She said they were both frightened for about a week, and then they decided the fear was simply an indication of how much it mattered, and they should proceed accordingly. He thought about that for a long time as they rode. They made camp that evening in a high meadow where the grass was still silvery from the cold, with a creek nearby, and the aspens making their particular sound in the evening wind, a sound like rain or like gentle applause, and Alberta cooked the supper for the first time, a simple thing made from the supplies they had picked up in Taos, salt pork and cornmeal and dried beans that she had put to soak that morning before they rode out, carried in a covered pot tied to her saddle. And the result was better than anything Edgar had made over a trail fire in 12 years of making things over trail fires. "Where did you learn to cook like this out here?" he asked. "My mother," she said. She could do extraordinary things with ordinary ingredients. She said it was a kind of problem-solving that she found satisfying. He ate 2 full plates of it and she looked pleased, in the contained way she looked pleased at things, and they sat with their coffee in the cooling evening and the aspens sighed around them, and the stars were so dense above the meadow that they blurred at the edges, and Edgar thought very clearly about what he was going to do and what he was not going to do and came to no satisfying conclusions. He said, "Alberta." It was the first time he had used her given name and they both felt it. She looked at him steadily. "I need to ask you something and I need you to answer it honestly," he said. "I generally do," she said. He looked at the fire. "The arrangement with Pierce. Do you want it?" The silence was long enough that he looked up from the fire to her face, and what he saw there was not what he had been afraid he might see, which was certainty and decision and the gentle but complete closing of a door. What he saw was a woman sitting very still with an expression that was complex and careful, and not happy. "I entered it honestly," she said finally. He seemed, through his letters, to be a serious and decent man. He said he wanted a partner, not a servant. He said he valued intelligence and directness. "That is not what I asked," Edgar said quietly. She looked at the fire. "No," she said, "it is not." He waited. The aspens talked in the darkness. "I have been asking myself that question since Santa Fe," she said at last. "I told myself the nerves were natural, that they were just the ordinary uncertainty of a new thing." She paused. "But I am beginning to think there is a difference between nerves and something one ought to listen to more carefully." He did not press her. He did not take any advantage of what she had said. He said, "You should know that whatever you decide, I will respect it. I am not in the business of influencing outcomes that are not mine to influence." She looked at him sharply then, and he met her eyes, and whatever she saw there made her look away first, which did not often happen, and there was a quality of agitation in her stillness afterward that told him the look had not missed its mark. "Go to sleep," she said softly, and it was not a dismissal. It was something else. The seventh day was different in a way that neither of them acknowledged directly, but both of them felt. They rode close together, closer than was strictly necessary on a wide trail, and they talked easily about ordinary things, and there were stretches of silence that were warm rather than neutral, and every now and then she would say something or make an observation and he would catch her eye and they would hold the look for just a beat too long to be accidental. He was suffering, and he was not miserable. It was a peculiar combination. In the early afternoon they stopped to eat at a high rocky overlook and were eating in companionable quiet when she said, "Tell me about the town, Coldwell Creek." He told her what he knew, which was not extensive. A mining town, perhaps 2 or 3 years old, built fast around the Silver Strike, the usual kind of settlement that appeared in the territories when someone found metal in the ground. It would have a main street with a saloon and a dry goods and probably a boarding house, and the houses around it would be a mix of solid and temporary, and the population would be heavily male and heavily transient. It would probably have a church by now because mining towns either had churches or they didn't, and the ones that had them were usually the more settled ones. She listened to this with a very particular expression. "And Mr. Pierce," she said, "he owns the mine." "One of them, according to Morse," Edgar said. "He had shares in 2 operations when he placed the ad." "He is successful," she said. "By the sound of it," Edgar said. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "My father used to say that success was not a character, that you could not know a man from his prosperity any better than you could know him from his address. You had to know him from how he treated people who had nothing he needed." Edgar said, "Your father sounds like he was a good man." "He was the best man I knew," she said simply, and there was no performance in it, just plain truth, and it hit Edgar somewhere in the place where love and loss live close together. Toward the end of the 7th day, they ran into genuine trouble for the first time, and it was not of the dramatic kind that got into stories, but the grinding, slow kind that was worse in some ways. Pitch went lame, a stone bruise on his right front that Edgar had missed in the morning's inspection, because the horse had been sound enough starting out, and the lameness announced itself about 5 miles from the nearest settlement. They slowed to a walk and Edgar got down and checked the hoof and confirmed the diagnosis, and the situation was simply what it was. They could not go faster without risking permanent damage to the horse, and they were 5 miles from Cimarron, which was the next town, and those 5 miles were going to take a while. He told her and she said, "We will walk then," and dismounted without being asked and led Clover beside him and pitched through the long golden afternoon, and they walked 5 miles in each other's company with the horses between them and the light going orange and then red, and then the first stars coming out, and they talked and were quiet and talked again, and it was the 5 miles that Edgar Kendrick would remember for the rest of his life. They talked about what they wanted. Not in the grand, sweeping way, not about destiny, but in the ordinary, specific way that reveals more than grandeur does. She wanted a garden. She had always wanted a garden, the kind her mother had kept in Las Cruces with tomatoes and herbs and a rosebush that had come from somewhere in Spain, she was told, and had survived the desert through sheer stubbornness. She wanted books. She wanted to know her neighbors well enough to argue with them about interesting things. She wanted to watch something grow. He told her slowly, because it was difficult to say, that he thought he had been in motion so long that he had forgotten to want things with any specificity. That what he had wanted was to keep moving, to stay ahead of something, and he was not entirely sure anymore what the something was. That the land out here was the first thing in his adult life that had felt like home, but that land without a life built on it was just scenery. She listened to all of this and she said, "What would you build if you built something?" He thought about it honestly. "A place on water," he said, "somewhere with a creek, cattle, not too many, enough land to be quiet on, a house that was built to last, not just to shelter." She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "That sounds like a life." And he looked at her in the last of the light, the horses walking slow between them, and he said, "It does to me too." They reached Cimarron after full dark, and he got pitch seen to by the stableman there, who examined the hoof and agreed it was a stone bruise, and recommended 2 days of rest and a poultice. 2 days in Cimarron. Edgar told him to do what was needed, and turned to find Alberta already arranging rooms at the small hotel across the street, with the calm efficiency of someone who had assessed the situation and acted on it. Cimarron was a real town, larger than Taos, with a bustling main street and a hotel that ran to 3 stories, and a dining room that actually had curtains on the windows. The town had a history of violence. The Lincoln County trouble was known as far south as Santa Fe, but it had calmed considerably in the past year, and was working toward the respectability that the cattle trade brought with it. They had supper in the hotel dining room, and there was a man playing a fiddle in the corner, and the music was good, and the food was better than the previous 2 hotel meals, and Alberta had ordered a glass of wine, which she rarely did, and the candle on the table lit her face in a way that made the room around her seem slightly less real than she was, and Edgar sat across from her, and stopped pretending to himself that he was managing anything. "I want to tell you something," he said, and his voice was level, which cost him something. She set down her fork and looked at him. "I understand the arrangement you have made," he said. "I understand that you made it in good faith and that you are a woman of your word. I understand that you are not the kind of person who makes a decision and unmakes it for the sake of feeling." "Edgar," she said. "I need to say this," he said. "I need to say it once. And then whatever you decide, I will ride you the rest of the way to Coldwell Creek and do my job and say nothing more about it." She was very still. "I have been falling in love with you since the 3rd mile of this journey," he said. "I am completely and irreversibly in love with you now, and it is the clearest thing I know at this moment, which is saying something because clarity is not a quality I have found in short supply. I am not asking you to break your word or alter your plans. I am only telling you the truth because you are someone who deserves to have the truth told to her, and I would rather tell it and lose than stay quiet and wonder for the rest of my life." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people sitting in the center of something important, something that required the courtesy of quiet. Then Alberta Lockhart said, in a voice that was very even and very careful, "You told me you were out of the business of influencing outcomes that were not yours to influence." "I did say that," he said. "That was before you fell irreversibly in love with me," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved. "That was approximately 20 minutes before that," he said. She looked down at her hands on the table. Then she looked up at him, direct and unguarded in a way that made his heart ache with the precision of it. "I need to think," she said. "Of course," he said. "I need to think honestly," she said, "which means I need to think about what I want rather than what I have arranged, and those 2 things are not always the same thing, and I have been aware of that for longer than I have wanted to be." "I know," he said gently. She said, "I will tell you in the morning." He said, "All right." She said, "Whatever I tell you in the morning, I need you to know that this has been—" She paused, looking for the word, and when she found it, it was quiet and simply placed, "significant. What these days have been. I need you to know that I know that." He said, "I know it too." She went upstairs and he sat in the dining room with a second cup of coffee long after the fiddler stopped playing, and he thought about what a man does when he has said the true thing and must now wait for the world to answer. He did not sleep much. He was up before dawn, and he sat on the steps of the hotel in the cool dark and watched Cimarron's Main Street lie quiet under the last of the stars. A dog moving somewhere at the far end. The smell of bread baking from the bakery that must open early for the working population of the town. She came out the door at first light fully dressed, her hair pinned and her hat in her hand, and she sat beside him on the step without saying anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I wrote a letter last night." He waited. "To Dalton Pierce," she said. "I will need to post it here before we go." His heart was not a quiet organ at that moment. "I told him," she said carefully, "that I had made the arrangement with the best intentions and that I had entered into it in good faith, and that I had been doing him and myself a disservice if I continued toward it now, knowing what I know about myself that I did not know when I agreed. I told him I was sorry for the inconvenience and the cost, and that I hoped he would find someone who wanted what he was offering with the whole of her, and not just the part that was looking for safety." She paused. "I told him that I had come to understand that a garden and books and a life built on solid ground were things I wanted to build rather than to be given, and that I intended to build them." Edgar said, very quietly, "Alberta, I am not telling you that letter means what you said last night," she said, and her voice had a care and a seriousness in it that he honored. "I am telling you that the letter is honest, that whatever I do from here, it will be honest. I will not go to Coldwell Creek and make a life with a man I do not love when I have just been shown, extremely clearly, what it feels like to be in the presence of someone I think I might be coming to love very much." He said nothing. The morning was the gray before sunrise, the mountains to the east just beginning to pick up the first hint of orange. She looked at him. "Are you going to say anything?" "I am terrified," he said. "I have not been terrified by anything in 12 years. I did not realize how large it was." She let out a breath that might have been a laugh or might have been relief, and she said, "Good, because I am too, and I would have thought less of you if you were not." He reached over slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a man who is not going to make a mistake about something this important, and he took her hand where it rested on her knee. Her hand turned under his and held on. They sat like that on the hotel steps while Cimarron woke around them, the morning coming in gold over the mountains, and neither of them said anything more, because there was nothing else that needed saying just then. The next 2 days in Cimarron while Pitch rested were the strangest and most contented days Edgar had spent in memory. They were not in a hurry. The urgency of delivery had dissolved with the letter Alberta had posted at the Cimarron post office, handed over the counter with steady hands, and a finality that he had watched with something between admiration and gratitude. They were simply 2 people in a town, and the simplicity of it was extraordinary. They walked the main street and she bought a book from the general store, a collected natural history that she carried under her arm with the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting to find a particular thing. He bought her coffee at the small establishment near the hotel where coffee was sold in the mid-morning, and they sat at a small table and talked about what came next. "What comes next is the question," she said honestly. "It is," he said. "I don't have a home to offer you. I have 12 years of riding and a reputation for reliability and $50 that is now mine to keep." He paused. "And I have about $2,000 saved that I have never had a reason to spend on anything permanent." She looked at him with interest. "Why have you never spent it?" "I was saving it for the place on the water," he said. "The cattle and the house built to last. I just had not gotten there yet." She was quiet for a moment. "You have been planning a specific life for some time without anyone to plan it with." "It appears so," he said. She drank her coffee. "I have $340, she said. "My parents' estate. It has been sitting in a bank in Las Cruces waiting for me to know what to do with it." He said, "That is a beginning." "It is a beginning," she said, and smiled at him with the full openness she rarely deployed, the wide unguarded smile that did terrible things to his composure, and he smiled back at her with all the relief of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been allowed to put it down. They left Cimarron on the morning of the 10th day, pitch sound again and the weather clear and warm, and they rode north not because they were going to Coldwell Creek, but because north was where the high country was, and they had not yet decided exactly where they were going. And there was something wonderful about that uncertainty, the way it felt like the beginning of something rather than the middle of something else. They talked seriously about destinations and options over the next 2 days. He knew the territory well. There were places north and west where the land was good and the water was reliable and the cattle grazing was sound. There were places that were already being settled in ways that suggested permanence, communities forming around churches and schools, and the kind of civic investment that indicated people intended to stay. There were places that were too wild and too remote, and places that were too crowded and too compromised. She listened to all of it and contributed her own thinking with a directness that he was beginning to find simply delightful. The way she would say, "No, that doesn't suit," or "Yes, tell me more about that," without the hedging that some people thought was politeness but was in fact just noise. They settled on a valley north of Cimarron that Edgar had passed through 3 times in his writing years, and had always noted with the half-attention of a man filing information for future reference. It was a broad, shallow valley, where a good creek ran year-round from snowmelt, with a mix of grassland and timber, and the mountains to the west providing the particular combination of shelter and view that made a place feel right rather than merely functional. He had heard that there was still government land available there for homestead claim. The decision was made over a campfire on the 11th night out from Santa Fe, and it was made with the plainness of 2 people who had been honest with each other long enough to trust the process. He asked her if she was sure. She said she was more sure than she had been of anything since her father's death had forced her to figure out how to live on her own terms. He said that was good enough for him. "I should tell you something," she said, "which is that I have never been afraid of the practical difficulty of anything. My mother's example was thorough in that regard. What I have been afraid of is a life that does not belong to me." "This life will belong to you," he said. "It will belong to us," she corrected, and met his eyes across the fire, and in the absolute simplicity and accuracy of that correction, he understood that she meant it in the full weight of the word, that it was not just a grammatical adjustment. "Alberta," he said. "Edgar," she said. "I would like to marry you," he said. "Properly and formally, and as soon as we are somewhere a proper and formal thing can be accomplished. But I want to ask you now because I don't want to go another day without having asked." She said, "I would like to marry you too," with the same plainness with which she said everything, and it was more romantic than any elaborate speech would have been, because it was entirely true. He got up and came around the fire to her, and he kissed her for the first time, careful and then not careful, and she kissed him back with a warmth and a conviction that made the stars overhead feel like they were applauding. And when they broke apart, she laughed with her whole face, and he buried his in her hair for a moment and held on. And the night was soft around them, and the creek was talking in the darkness, and the horses were quiet on their pickets. "We are going to need a minister," she said against his shoulder. "There is one in Cimarron," he said. "We passed his church. We are going back to Cimarron. Unless you object to starting a marriage with a reasonable backtrack," he said. She laughed again, and the sound of it in the darkness was the best sound he had heard in his life. They rode back to Cimarron with a happiness that was not loud but was completely pervasive, the way warmth is, touching everything. He had sent a wire from Cimarron's telegraph office when they had been there before, to Harlan Morse in Santa Fe, explaining the altered situation in the most basic and professional terms he could manage. The Escort job was dissolved. The money would be returned minus reasonable expenses. The client had changed her plans. He had not explained further and did not feel he needed to. The Reverend Marcus Hewitt of the Cimarron Presbyterian Church was a lean gray man of about 60, with a practical view of his function, in a territory full of people trying to build something from nothing. And he agreed to marry them in his church on a Thursday morning, with the woman from the bakery and the stableman from the hotel stable as witnesses. Alberta wore her white shirtwaist and a piece of blue ribbon she had bought from the dry goods store and pinned at her collar. And she looked at Edgar across the short space of the church aisle with brown eyes that were steady and clear and full of the particular warmth that was becoming, in his experience, the most reliable thing in his world. The vows were the old words, the ones that had been said for a very long time, and they said them to each other with the intention of people who had done their thinking in advance and were not going to unmake it. Reverend Hewitt pronounced them married, and the bakery woman cried a little, and the stableman shook Edgar's hand with the vigorous feeling of someone who found other people's happiness to be a legitimate cause for celebration. They had a wedding supper at the hotel, just the two of them, with the hotel's best effort at a proper meal, which included an actual roast chicken and a piece of cake that the hotel manager had ordered from the bakery on the occasion. And they sat across from each other in the candle-lit dining room and talked about their plans with the ease of people who have earned the right to plan together. She said, "I want to write to the bank in Las Cruces as soon as we have an address." "We will have an address," he said. "How long before we have a house?" she asked. "We can start with what will shelter us while we build something better," he said. "There is a way to do these things in stages. I have seen enough homesteads go up to know the sequence," she said. "I want the garden as early as the spring." "The garden can go in even before the house is finished," he said. "The soil will need time to establish." She looked at him with a brightness that was very close to joy. "You know about gardens." "My mother's," he said. It was the one thing she was entirely unreasonable about. Everything else in her life she held with her hands open, but the garden she held on to. Alberta reached across the table and took his hand, and they sat like that while the evening went on around them, and it was not the most dramatic moment of the day or of their journey, but it was the most complete, the feeling of something having arrived at its proper destination. The homestead they found in the valley north and east of Cimarron was on 160 acres of government land that Edgar filed for through the Homestead Act, one of the provisions of the law that had been encouraging settlement in the territories since before the war. The land was good. He had known it would be. The creek ran through the western quarter, and there were cottonwoods along it and a natural shelter of rising ground to the north that would break the winter wind, and the soil in the valley floor was deep and dark in a way that would grow things. They spent the first summer living in a tent, and then in a one-room structure that Edgar built with the help of two neighboring homesteaders, men named Ortiz and Calderon, who had been in the valley for 2 years and knew its ways and were generous with their knowledge. Alberta cooked for the working parties and organized the materials with a logistical competence that made the construction move faster than it would have otherwise. And she learned from Doña Elisa Ortiz the particular way that the valley's clay mixed with straw and dried in the sun to make the kind of walls that held heat and cold alike. It was hard work, and it was good work, the kind that moves from morning to evening with purpose and produces at the end of the day a visible thing that was not there at the beginning. Alberta fell into it with the same quality she brought to everything: full attention and practical honesty, and the capacity to find the interesting thing in whatever she was doing. By fall they had a proper house, 2 rooms and a covered porch, with a cast-iron stove for the winter that had come from the Cimarron dry goods on a wagon with a great deal of careful packing. And the garden had indeed been planted in the spring, and had produced throughout the summer with a generosity that pleased Alberta in a way that was deep and particular, the pleasure of someone who has found the thing they were designed for. She had planted tomatoes and beans and squash and 2 kinds of herbs and 1 struggling but determined rosebush that had come from a cutting given to her by Doña Elisa from a plant that had come, like the one in Las Cruces, from very far away, and had survived by virtue of sheer stubbornness. Edgar had registered the cattle by October, a modest beginning of 30 head on the valley grass, and he had joined the informal community of ranchers and homesteaders that was forming in the valley with the same care he brought to his judgment of trail and weather, taking time before speaking, knowing the ground before he moved on it. The valley was its own small society, with its own codes and its own history, and he became part of it the way a man becomes part of a landscape, steadily and without announcement. He had written to his family in Tennessee, what remained of it, to tell them where he was. He had not expected the letter he received in return, from a younger sister he had not seen in 14 years, who was living in Memphis now with a husband and children, and who wrote with a warmth that made him sit on the porch in the autumn evening and read it twice. He read it to Alberta afterward, and she listened with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered, and when he finished she said, "You should invite her to come." "It is a long way from Memphis," he said. "Good things are often a long way," she said, and looked at the mountains going purple in the last light. He wrote back and invited his sister and her family to come when they could manage it. The winter was hard in the way that the territory winters were hard. Cold that came down from the mountains with a thoroughness that made the walls of the house feel very necessary, and the cast-iron stove feel like a friend. They were snowed in for 5 days in February, the kind of snow that comes quiet and deep and rearranges the landscape so completely that the familiar becomes strange. And they spent those 5 days close together in the 2-room house, with the horses in the small barn Edgar had built, and the cattle sheltered in the draw where the willows broke the wind. Alberta read to him in the evenings by the stove, from the natural history book she had bought in Cimarron, and from the other books she had been acquiring steadily from the Cimarron store, and from the catalog order she had placed with a publisher in Denver. And he listened to her voice in the warm, small space of the house with the wind outside, and the snow on the roof, and the stove ticking, and thought about the boy from eastern Tennessee, who had come west at 17 to outrun a failing farm and had found, 12 years and half a continent later, that he had not been outrunning anything, but simply moving towards something he had not yet known to want. She was 3 months pregnant when the snow melted in the spring, and she told him on a morning when the creek was running high and the first green was coming up in the valley grass, matter of fact and warm, and watching his face with that directness that could still catch him unprepared. He had not been prepared for the feeling. He had thought he was prepared because he had thought about it in the abstract, in the way a man thinks about the future, and the abstract had not given him the actual thing, which was a fullness in the chest so complete that it was almost indistinguishable from pain. "Say something," she said. "I am extremely happy," he said, and the understatement of it made her laugh, the bright particular laugh that still, 8 months after he had first heard it, made him feel like the world had tilted slightly on its axis in the best possible way. He kissed her in the middle of the porch in the spring morning with the creek noise and the birds and the new green valley around them, and she put her arms around him and held on with the conviction of someone who means it completely. The summer of 1879 was the summer Edgar Kendrick understood what it meant to have built something. The valley was in full productivity, the garden enormous now, and managed with the obsessive affection Alberta brought to it. The cattle herd expanded to 60 head with a young bull purchased from the Ortiz family. The house itself improved with a proper sleeping room added at the back, and a shelf for the growing library of books that was beginning to require engineering to accommodate. His sister Ruth came in August, with her husband Thomas Willard and their 2 children, traveling by train to Raton and then by wagon to the valley. And the reunion was awkward and warm in the way of reunions between people who have lived entirely different lives for a long time and must remember how to be family again. Ruth was a practical, energetic woman who looked at Alberta with the quick assessing look of someone who has standards and is deciding whether they have been met, and who softened visibly over the course of the 4-day visit into something that looked like genuine approval and real affection. On the last evening of the visit, Ruth sat with Alberta on the porch while Edgar and Thomas walked the pasture fence line in the last of the light. And Edgar did not know what was said between them, but came back to find them in the attitude of two women who have decided to like each other. And Alberta had a quality of ease about her that he associated with conversations that had gone well and meant something. "She is wonderful," Ruth told him privately, with a directness that was the family trait he had apparently not taken with him when he left Tennessee, but which had remained intact in his sister. "She is exactly the right person for you. I knew inside of an hour. Thomas agreed by supper." "I knew inside of 3 miles," Edgar said. Ruth looked at him with the expression of an older sister who has been waiting her whole life for her brother to figure something out. "Well," she said, "you were always slow about the important things." He laughed, and she laughed, and the evening was warm and full of the particular sound of a place that had become home. The child was born in October, on an afternoon when the cottonwoods along the creek were at their full gold, and the air had the sharp clarity that comes to high desert country in the fall, the kind of air that makes everything look slightly more itself than usual. Doña Elisa Ortiz came as the midwife, as it had been arranged, and the birth was long and difficult enough that Edgar, banned from the room and sitting on the porch with his hat in his hands, went through every variety of fear that exists. Doña Elisa came to the door with the expression of someone who has good news and knows the value of delivering it plainly. "A boy," she said. "Both of them well." Edgar went in, and Alberta was tired in the profound way of someone who has done something enormous, and she had the baby in her arms with the focused wonder of someone who is still learning what a thing is, and the baby was small and pink, and entirely real in the way that new things in the world are real before anything has had a chance to complicate them. "Come and see him," Alberta said, and her voice was tired and clear, and he came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. He had to look away for a moment at the window and the gold of the cottonwoods through it. "Edgar," she said softly. He looked back at her. She was watching him with the eyes that had been watching him honestly since the first morning on Palace Avenue in Santa Fe, and she was smiling with a tiredness that had happiness in it like light in water. "What shall we call him?" she asked. He thought about it. He thought about the trail and the meadowlark and the hawk and the 5 miles on foot, and the steps of the Cimarron Hotel in the early morning, and the fire in the high meadow and the aspens and the river, and all of the accumulated days of a love that had declared itself at mile 3 and had been building ever since. "James," he said. "James William Kendrick." James had been his father's name, and William had been hers. "Yes," she said, and settled the baby a little more firmly in her arms. "That is exactly right." He put his arm around her, careful of her tiredness, and she leaned into his side, and James William Kendrick slept with the imperious confidence of someone who has no idea of the magnitude of the welcome he has arrived into. The years that followed were the kind of years that do not make dramatic stories but make real lives. They made 2 more children, a daughter named Eleanor Rose, born in the summer of 1881. Who inherited her mother's brown eyes and her father's quietness and grew up to have opinions about everything in the most extraordinary combination, and a second son named Samuel, born in 1884, who was loud and cheerful from his first breath and grew a foot taller than his brother by the time they were both adults. The valley grew around them, more homesteaders arriving each year, and a small school was established in 1882 in which Alberta was the founding teacher, riding the 3 miles to the schoolhouse 4 days a week on Clover, who was getting older and had opinions about cold mornings but remained, as she had always been, perfectly behaved. The school was the thing that made the valley into a community in the deepest sense, the gathering of the young toward knowledge, and Alberta taught with the fullness of attention that she brought to everything she chose to do. Edgar ran the cattle and the land with a steadiness and a care that built, over the years, into a solid operation, not enormous but sound, the kind of ranch that belonged to the country it occupied rather than fighting it. He learned from the Ortiz and Calderon families, and from the land itself, which was the best teacher he had found outside of Alberta, and he came to know the valley and its ways with the same deep fluency with which he had once known the trails. He was known in the valley and in Cimarron, and in the surrounding county, as a reliable and straight man, the kind of person that the community brought its disputes to for the calm judgment that disputes needed, and he carried this responsibility seriously because it had been offered to him seriously. In the fall of 1883, a letter arrived from Caleb Foster, the young man with the broken leg who they had carried into Taos on Clover back in the spring of '78. He had somehow tracked them through the records of the territory, the homestead filing and the school registration, and he had written to say that he was well, that his leg had healed cleanly, that he was working on a cattle ranch outside of Santa Fe, that he was recently married to a woman from a Mexican family whose name was Rosa, and who he described with the particular overfullness of a man who is still astonished by his own good fortune. He said he thought about the two people who had carried him into Taos often, and that he wanted them to know that their kindness had mattered, and that he had tried to pass it forward in the years since. Alberta read the letter aloud at the supper table while James, 5 years old and already with strong views about everything, ate his beans with the focused attention of someone who is listening without appearing to listen. When she finished, James said, "Who is Caleb Foster?" Alberta and Edgar looked at each other across the table, and the look was full of the accumulated warmth of 5 years and 3 children and a life built carefully and together, and Edgar said to his son, "A young man we met on a trail once. He needed help and we helped him, and it appears to have turned out well for everyone." James considered this. "Did he have a horse?" "He had a dead horse," Edgar said. That was the beginning of the problem. James was satisfied with this and returned to his beans, and Alina, who was 2.5 and had been observing the conversation with the interest she brought to everything, said with great conviction, "Poor horse." "Poor horse indeed," Alberta said, and met Edgar's eyes, and they were both trying not to laugh and not succeeding very well, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and the night was coming in blue and cold outside the window, and the house was full of the particular sound of a family that has made itself at home in the world. In the spring of 1885, Edgar and Alberta Kendrick rode together for the first time in several years on the long trail, not the Santa Fe route, but south along the Pecos to visit a rancher who had cattle Edgar was considering purchasing. They rode early, before the children were up, leaving them in the charge of the Ortiz family's eldest daughter who came to sit with them on occasions like this. They rode in the spring morning with the mountains to the west still holding their snow, and the valley floor coming green and new around them, and they rode close together because that was how they rode, had always ridden when they were together, and Alberta was saying something about the grade of the south pasture grass that required his opinion, and a meadowlark somewhere in the grass did something ridiculous and absurd and entirely indifferent to observation, and Alberta laughed. The laugh came out before she could stop it, the real one, brief and bright and entirely her own, and she glanced at him sideways to see if he had caught it. He had caught it. He was looking at her with the look that had been 12 years in the developing, the look of a man who knows he is where he is supposed to be and finds the fact of it still extraordinary. "What?" she said. "You know what?" he said. She rode for a moment in silence, but her mouth was curved. "The bird was objectively absurd," she said. "The bird was objectively absurd," he agreed. She looked at him, full-faced in the morning light with the mountains and the new grass and the long life they had made behind and around them, and she said, "Edgar Kendrick." "Alberta Kendrick," he said. "I am glad you told the truth in Cimarron," she said. "In the dining room, I am glad you said it." He looked at her across the few feet between their horses, the distance that was no distance at all anymore, that had closed so completely in the years of a life together that he could not fully remember what it had felt like to be separate from her. "So am I," he said. They rode on south in the spring morning, through the beautiful wide land of the territory they had made their home, with the hawk-sharp air and the horses' easy gaits and the whole long-known day ahead of them. And there was nothing missing and nothing unresolved. Just the good, ordinary, magnificent fact of two people who had found each other at mile 3 of a journey that had turned out to be a great deal longer and finer than either of them had known to expect. The valley got its post office in 1886 and its own church in 1887, and by then the Kendrick Ranch was one of the established ones, known in the county for its good cattle and its honest dealing, and the school that Alberta had expanded with the help of county funds she had lobbied for with a thoroughness that the county official involved later described as the most persistent civil advocacy he had ever encountered, which he meant as a complaint, and which Alberta received as a compliment. James turned 10 in 1888 and was already riding with his father on the range, with the competence of a boy who has been watching a skilled man work since before he could properly remember. Eleanor was 7 and reading with a hunger that required regular replenishment from the book catalog in Denver. Samuel was 4 and interested in everything that moved, which in a ranch household was a very broad category. The rosebush that Alberta had grown from Doña Alyssa's cutting had become, by 1888, a substantial affair on the south wall of the house, the kind of rosebush that established itself so thoroughly in a place that it becomes part of the architecture. It bloomed in June in a color that was between red and pink, the kind of color that looks like it was made for the particular light of the high desert, and Alberta cut sprays of it for the kitchen table, and for the schoolhouse, and for the Ortiz family, and for the graves of 2 valley people who had died in the hard winter of '86, and whose small cemetery plot she visited on Sundays with the steady faithfulness of someone who does not forget. Edgar Kendrick turned 41 in the summer of 1889 and had never felt more at home in his own life. He had the land and the water and the house built to last, and the cattle and the family, all the specific things he had said to Alberta on those 5 miles of walking, and he had also the things he had not known to include in the list. The school and the neighbors who argued about interesting things, and the garden that grew with unreasonable generosity every summer, and the woman who read to him by the stove in the winter evenings, and who looked at him still across the kitchen table, or the morning trail with brown eyes that were direct and unguarded and full of everything they had built together. He thought sometimes about the version of himself that had ridden out of Santa Fe that spring morning in 1878 with $50 in his coat, and a plan to deliver a woman to a man she had never met, and had made it 3 miles before the plan had begun to come apart at its essential seams. He thought about what that man had been saving his $2,000 for without knowing exactly what. He thought about the trail and the hawk and the Chama River, and the 5 miles on foot, and the steps of the hotel in the early morning, and he found that these memories had acquired, over the years, the quality of the stories that families tell each other, the ones that get repeated because they belong to everyone who came after. He had told James and Eleanor and Samuel the story of how he had met their mother. He had told it fully and honestly, because she had been present for most of the telling and she would have accepted nothing less. He told them about the hire and the trail and the hawk and the 3 miles. He told them about Caleb Foster with the broken leg and the fording of the Chama and the 5 miles on foot and the fire in the high meadow, and what their mother had said about the difference between nerves and something worth listening to more carefully. James said when he was old enough to understand the sequence, "But you were supposed to take her to a different man." "I was," Edgar said. "And you did not," James said, with the tone of a child who is locating the moral lesson. "I told her honestly what I felt," Edgar said, "and she told me honestly what she felt, and then we made our own decisions about what to do next." James thought about this. Was she not worried about Mr. Pierce? He said, "She wrote him a very honest letter," Edgar said. "She was always honest about everything, which was one of the first things I knew about her." Alberta, who had been listening from the kitchen, came to the doorway with the expression of someone who has been listening to a story about herself and finds it reasonably accurate. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "found his answer. He married a woman in Denver the following year, I heard from Mr. Morse in Santa Fe years later. He seemed content. James looked relieved that this loose end had been resolved. Alina, who had been listening with the focused interest of a 7-year-old whose interest in stories was voracious, said, "And the man in Santa Fe who hired you, did he mind?" "He minded the money," Edgar said. "He minded it less after I sent it back." "You sent the whole $50 back," James said. "I kept expenses," Edgar said. "It was a matter of fairness." Alberta came fully into the room and sat down with the children, and the look she gave Edgar over their heads was the look that contained 12 years of knowing a person fully, and the warmth in it was so complete and specific that he could feel it from across the room. "The point," she said to the children, in the tone that was the schoolteacher's tone, the one that meant something important was being organized, "is not the money or the letter or even the trail. The point is that your father told the truth when it was frightening to do so, and that I told the truth in return, and that truth is the only solid ground that anything real can be built on." Samuel, who was 4 and had been lying on the floor with a stick he was using to navigate an imaginary landscape, looked up and said, "Like our house." "Like our house," Alberta said. "Exactly like our house." Edgar looked at her in the lamplight. In the kitchen of the house they had built together in the valley with the creek and the mountains and the cottonwoods and the stubborn rosebush and the school down the road. And he thought about the meadowlark at mile 3, and the way her laugh had come out before she could stop it, and the way the whole rest of his life had quietly arranged itself in consequence. He thought it was the best $50 job he had ever refused to finish.